Hi, it's Dwyer. It is early in the morning, around 1 a.m. Pacific time on April the 7th, 2025. Right, money 1776.com, a free site. Also, always 1776.com, a free site. Nothing I say in this video should be construed to be investment advice. I want everyone to do their own due diligence. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, supply sider Art Laffer. If you remember the Reagan Revolution, you understand that Art Laffer was a trusted consultant for Ronald Reagan, right? Let me also point out, too, Laffer is someone to look at because he has certain philosophies about being self-employed, about not accepting money from politicians, right? There's more there than meets the eye. He has long maintained that Donald Trump, who he also advises, doesn't truly believe in tariffs. Rather, Trump is using tariffs to get other things. Right now, in the short run, there's going to be a lot of disruption. Quite frankly, if you're an equity holder, the Buffett indicator for the stock market indicates that the stock market, which is valued at greater than the GDP, believe it or not, is at 190% of where it should be. In other words, folks, for the typical equity holder, on average, not everyone, but on average, just understand you're looking at still, after a 10% drawdown, you're looking at a long way to go. Right now, Treasury Secretary Besant, and he's excellent, has talked about how only a very small subset of the United States owns stocks. Right? His point is that it's really only the wealthier who own stocks. What's more important is popping the bubble. Because understand, to maintain this bubble, people are taking on debts. The businesses that have issued the stock are taking on debts. That's driving up, as you can imagine, the interest rate. That's crowding out private mom and pop borrowers from the lending market. That's also making assets unaffordable, right? The runaway stock market, and we haven't had a recession for a long time. The runaway stock market, quite frankly, has exacerbated wealth inequality, right? The person who owns hard assets, right? Housing, gold, land, is also the person most likely to hold equities, right? Ownership interests in corporations, publicly traded corporations. So, while wages have not kept up, right, the person who owns real property, real estate, right, as well as, stock companies, let's say, for purposes of this video, Mag 7 companies, they're actually making money hand over fist. So let me name another name, right? And let me be quite frank here. My philosophy on life is to get information wherever it's offered. right? I'm not one of these people who believes that, Art Laffer, supply sider, there was a time in the 80s where Reagan wanted ketchup to be classified as a vegetable for student lunch programs. I'm not a person who believes that you ignore points of view simply because the person with the point of view might not support the same political candidate that you do. Right? I'm from the other side of the street. I'm from the side of the street where information doesn't have a party affiliation. Right? You're on a constant hunt for real information that you can use as a tool in your decisions to make money, to protect your family, to put a roof over your head. Right? So, let me name a controversial figure. Stanford Law School grad, right? Major entrepreneur, involved in the past with Elon Musk in business ventures. Peter Thiel, right? Famed investor. Understand that he talks about how, because wages haven't kept up with real estate appreciation, for example, the people who own homes in a city are pulling away from the workers in that city, such that the workers can no longer afford to live in the city. Right? So economics right now is out of whack. Just understand that. Let me add my own 2 cents here. I know it's counterintuitive. I know the critics are out in force. I understand that Bitcoin has only been with us for under 2 decades, right? A little bit more than a decade, right? Let me just make a point here. I, and more importantly, others, right? Michael Saylor of Strategy, for example, see Bitcoin as a risk-off asset. Now, what that means is that the stock market's blowing up, housing's blowing up, right? Other assets, cars are harder to finance. You say to yourself, okay, I need to put my money in risk-off assets. I need to sell risky assets, right? Stock holdings are going down. I need to move the money to safe assets. Something that shouldn't be subject to the volatility of the general market. Right? So let me just say, and here's a split in the market. We'll see how it lands. You have, and I'll use him because he's an icon, right? You have people like Peter Schiff talking about Bitcoin going to zero, right? Let me just point out, I'm from the other side of the street. I believe Bitcoin is a risk-off asset. In other words, let's say I have money in some hypothetical equity that has a price earnings multiple of 35 or more. Right? Understand that means that if the company continues to make money at the same rate going forward, it would take 35 years before the investment pays for itself. Right? We're oversimplifying, but this is a YouTube video. I have to conform to the format. Right now, let's say I decide, okay, I'm going to get rid of that, 35 PE tech stock. Where can I park the money? Right now, let's say I'm a skeptic of fiat currency. In other words, government issued money like the US dollar that has lost value versus gold since Nixon closed the gold window in the early 70s. Right? So let's say I don't want to just hold cash. Right? If I'm going to hold cash, I might as well lend the money to the federal government. Get myself an interest-bearing treasury, right? So that I have the liquidity. In other words, there's a market where I can sell the bond, and I'm getting interest, right? Right now, the 10 years are out 4% interest, right? People who are very savvy might invest in a 6-month, because the idea is that once the, realization hits that, the tariff threat might be temporary for some countries, right? Then markets might adjust. Markets historically have adjusted, right? Sooner or later, believe it or not, markets clear, and things might change, and I might be able to then redeploy the capital to something that earns more than the rate of return on a treasury. Right? Let me just say, too, there's no reason to be in business taking the risk of setting up an uncertain business if your rate of return is going to be less than the rate of return you would get investing in a U.S. Treasury. Right? Just food for thought. Right? It's easier theoretically to be a creditor of the United States government than it is to be an entrepreneur, especially in uncertain economic times. Right? So let me just point out, to sum up here, Laffer believes that Trump is really using tariffs as a tool. That Trump's real game is to do what he himself has discussed as a negotiation strategy in his books. Right? People know that Trump enters the room and he asks for a lot. Right? He asks for too much. Then, of course, as the negotiations progress, Trump cuts it back to something a little bit more reasonable. Well, let me tell you what's happened in the last few hours. Now, understand, we fought for years in Vietnam. When I was a kid, the Vietnam War was front and center. Right? That took years, folks. Right? If you go back to the Kennedy assassination, understand back then, Vietnam was an issue. Believe it or not, since Trump has announced his tariffs, Vietnam has come to the table that fast and has said, hey, we'll drop all tariffs that we have against the United States. They're not alone. Taiwan, and here's where it gets politically sensitive, right? Because you understand China and Taiwan used to be part of the same country. Right? They're split families right now, right? Part of the family is in China, part of the family is in Taiwan. You understand there was a time where China was communist. Right? Now it's evolving, now it's moving toward freer markets. Right? Well, understand Taiwan has stepped up and has said we will drop all tariffs against United States products. Now, there's going to be a negotiation that takes place. I believe Donald Trump believes that free trade has wrecked America's manufacturing sector. I believe Donald Trump believes that because of the historical profitability and importance of the American market, right? Most places don't have as robust a market as we have. He understands that some foreign capital groups might want to actually open up factories in the United States to avoid tariffs, right? So I believe Trump is going to try to keep some marginal tariff, maybe the 10% that's been bandied about on some countries, right? The idea is that if you're going to profit from the American market, right, and we have some of the highest per capita incomes in the world, not the highest, but among the highest, right? And of course, there's strength in numbers, and the United States has hundreds of millions of people, right? Also, other countries fell for Karl Marx. In the United States, you have something called private property. Let's just say that the U.S. judicial system, contract rights, give entrepreneurs a legal footing they don't have in some other countries, right? So just understand, it's not just Vietnam and Taiwan that as of early this morning, have advised the Trump administration that they're ready to roll back their tariffs against American goods. But according to reports, it's 48 other countries. Right? So let me just say, here's where it gets interesting. Right? I believe Trump is going to hammer out some trade deals. Right? I believe you're going to have, some transition period where capital is going to be redeployed. Some foreign leaders who themselves are subject to votes and who have to look tough to their constituents, right? Right now you have an election taking place in Canada, for example, and the candidates up there, major candidates, including the incumbent, of course, are prioritizing, pointing out that they're tough enough to stand up to Donald Trump. Right? The question is, who is Donald Trump? Is he an ideologue who, wants to shut us off from the rest of the world? Or is he, as Art Laffer is suggesting, using tariffs as a carrot to get trade deals that allow the United States to conduct trade on more equal footing in countries that have levied heavy tariffs against the United States? Right now, people here who follow my channel know that I'm anti-tariff. Right? I'm one of these people who believes that the proper response to a foreign country's tariff is to do nothing. Right? In other words, you benefit from getting cheap goods from that country. If that country wants to foolishly tax their own citizens when they are trying to buy American products, that's not our problem. Right? The goal of government should be the greatest good for Americans. Right? It shouldn't be, hey, they're levying a tax on our vehicles. We need to get back at them. Right? We need to engage in this tit for tat that might actually have people paying more than they should, more than they would without the tariff. Right? But let me just say, if this tariff issue gets resolved quickly with major exporters, right? And folks, understand, Vietnam has a lower cost structure right now than China. Right? If this tariff issue gets resolved quickly, and if it actually induces Vietnamese companies to create subsidiaries in the United States to avoid the tariff altogether and to actually produce goods locally and sell them in the United States, then just understand the situation is going to be far more deflationary than the current status quo. Right? That 10% tariff that Trump wants to issue on the rest of the world might actually lead to foreign capital moving into the United States. Foreign companies creating American subsidiaries. More importantly, hiring American workers. Right? And of course, producing the goods and services at cheaper rates. Right? Having more goods and services in the marketplace, more competition, leading to costs dropping to close to marginal costs. Right? So, how am I playing tomorrow morning? Right? Just understand. And I know it's counterintuitive, and I know this is not accepted by the Peter Schiff crowd. Right? They'll handle their money, I'll handle my money. I do agree with Peter Schiff on gold. Right? I agree with Peter Schiff on silver. I think those in uncertain economic times are safe havens. Right? Those are risk-off assets. Figure out what risk-off assets are. Right? Understand. Right now, energy prices are dropping. The price of a barrel of oil is dropping. Now, the question here is, and it's a big question, this is what makes wealthy people, right? Do you believe in what, let's name a excellent YouTuber, Chris Martenson of Peak Prosperity. Again, Chris Martenson of Peak Prosperity. Also, Doomberg, right? They talk about the energy space, right? If you believe that we are close to or already dealing with what's called peak oil, then understand you're going to have buying opportunities pop up. The timing, of course, is up to you. I'll just tell you, there are many great investors. Jim Rogers, who's on YouTube, right, who flatly will say, I'm not a market timer. I don't even try to time the market. I'm just looking for good investments that are fairly priced today, that I think have upside. Right? The energy space is going to make or break many. Now, I've owned some Exxon stock for years. Symbol is XOM. Right? I believe everyone, given the volatility of energy, I believe everyone should own at least some energy plays. Right? And so just understand that I'm prepared to take a loss in the short term so I can get a gain in the longer term. Right? So some OPEC nations have announced that they're going to increase the supply of oil. There's speculation that oil's going to drop to $60 a barrel. Right? Exxon itself was up around $120 a share. Now it's down around $105 a share. Right? What I've found is in moments like this, if you believe that we're going to have energy challenges, right? Understand they're building a lot of nuclear plants in China. We've been slow here, in part because of 3 Mile Island, in part because of, our belief that, these nuclear plants could lead to radioactivity and catastrophe and aren't environmentally friendly. We've been slow in making the investment toward nuclear energy, which is a big mistake. So I need for people to understand that as you see energy fall off the table, understanding that fracking and extracting energy from shale is short-lived. In other words, that's not the same as, creating an oil well that's going to last you for years. If you believe that we're at risk of peak oil, it's only a matter of time before a barrel of oil goes up in value. You might notice, I do sports videos online here. You might notice that Saudi Arabia is diversifying its economy. They're now in the fight game, right? They've hooked up with Dana White of UFC. And, they're putting on big cards involving the biggest names in boxing. Right? They, of course, are, completely updating their infrastructure, becoming much more tourist friendly. You might know that United Arab Emirates is heavily into digital assets and cryptocurrency. Understand, a lot of that might be out of necessity because, energy, they might realize that oil, we're around peak oil, that's going to ebb, that you need other streams of income, right? So just understand what's going to happen Monday. I want to be as clear as I can be. A lot of people are going to lose a lot of money as a stock market that is 1.9 times where it should be reverts to the mean. Right? That's all that's happening, folks. Right? Historically, the stock market should be on par with GDP. Folks, believe it or not, the last few years, the stock market was so overvalued because there wasn't a recession, because we were, hiring a lot of people in the public sector, juicing numbers, etc., taking on a lot of debt. Every other company seems to be buying back shares, which used to be taboo. Just understand that the stock market is 1.9 times what it should be. That's going to deflate. Credit is going to dry up, right? Because as loan collateral deflates in value, bank scrutiny of an applicant's credit worthiness is going to increase, right? So a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money. If you believe, as I do, that not just Bitcoin, and I know that there's a whole other group, Max Kaiser, for example, is a Bitcoin maximalist. He believes that everything that's not Bitcoin is going to go to zero, right? If you, as I do, believe that Bitcoin's a risk-off asset and there are other risk-off assets, and folks, the digital asset space is getting decimated. In other words, there are certain narratives for the future, right? Real-world assets going online, for example, right? You have certain digital assets, right? I'll name one here. Ondo Finance, right? Again, Ondo Finance, O-N-D-O Finance. Look them up, right? If you believe that real-world assets are going to be going online, you have some staggering values right now, right? But you have to be the person who, as folks are fleeing, figuratively speaking, the burning building, you're prepared to walk in that burning building to buy digital assets, right? For me, I'm looking at oil carefully. As I've said here earlier too, I want people to compare the PE of Google to other Mag 7 stocks. Understand, Google is on the cutting edge of AI, right? The difference between Google and some of these other companies is Google can fold AI into products they already are offering the market, that are already entrenched in the market. right? Google Maps, etc., that people already use, that don't need to be introduced to the public, that are already popular with the public. Understand, Google could give you that AI as part of the Google experience.
As a large language model, I don't have
right? I have no doubt, by the way, that that was part of a Google app that I have on my phone. Let's just say tomorrow is going to not only be a tough day for many, paradoxically, it's going to be a great day for many. The people who were in Bitcoin early, they remember the price at which they got Bitcoin. Right? There'll be conversations where someone will say, yeah, I got Bitcoin at $58 a coin. They remember. Right, folks? I'm just telling you, there's some stunning values right now in the digital asset world, if you've been following it, that could make tomorrow one of those days, well, later today, right? April the 7th, could make the market opening, an event for many people, right? In the oil space, because I believe we're close to peak oil, and because I believe the United States of America is going to have to get with the program with nuclear energy. Folks, that's a must, right? Let's just say that I'm prepared to buy some oil companies, right? You can just look at what Warren Buffett's doing. You don't even have to be that savvy. You don't have to understand how to fully read a balance sheet, an income statement, right? You can just look at what the best investors are doing. Online you can say, well, what are Warren Buffett's core holdings? You're going to find that there's some energy companies on there. And you can say, this guy knows what he's doing. Let me buy some of these energy companies. Sure. There's going to be a time where it's a ride down. Because understand, we can't quite figure out what's risk on and what's risk off in the short term. Right? I'm just telling you that if the thesis is correct, if we are at or near peak oil, that oil investment is going to go back on the way up. Right? Food for thought. Anyway, keep an eye on the countries that come to the table to drop tariffs. That's very bullish. That's very bullish for the American economy, right? Let me just say, I believe that the U.S. is savvy enough to understand that it can't allow other countries with tariffs against American goods to channel their goods and services through Taiwan so that it doesn't get hit with more than a 10% tariff on its way to the United States, right? Just understand, if you hear that China and the United States have reached a deal, that'll be huge, right? Obviously, America's two biggest trading partners are Canada and Mexico. If you hear that there's a commitment by those countries with the United States where the tariffs are going to be minimal, that would be a coup. Understand, Elon Musk has broken with the president on the issue of tariffs. Elon Musk wants no more than 10% tariffs levied against European countries, right? If European countries come to the table, this might be a coordinated leak with the media to try to guide other countries who are in tariff feuds with the United States to the magical 10% number. that would be a coup. Understand, the media's talk here in the United States is a little bit dated. You understand that the African continent right now has more than 1 billion people, right? Far more people in Africa than in Europe, right? If you hear that the African continent is lining up to strike deals with the United States, right, with an understanding too that digital assets, which are spreading like wildfire in Africa, come with their own accounting. In other words, if I'm using Bitcoin as my currency, I actually have a ledger. And I can go on that ledger and I can see the transactions. Right? If you understand that modernization makes it easier for emerging economies to actually engage in commerce. Right? And if you hear that African countries are lining up to strike deals with the United States, that would be extremely bullish for both. Right? So, while I concede the U.S. stock market is going to be bearish for some time, right? We've gone through in our history several year periods of time where the stock market has been flat, right? 68 to 82, for example. Just look it up, right? For a decade or more, right? Great Depression all the way to 51, right? Just understand that in this era of quick information, digital record keeping allows for quick transitions, right? Much quicker than when everyone was using paper and when everything was labor intensive. Right now things are capital intensive, more capital intensive, right? We might be able to get through this uncertain period where we can't quite figure out whether Bitcoin is a risk-on or a risk-off asset, where we don't quite know, right? The people in the corner of the room are the only ones talking about peak oil, even as, fracking situations are drying up, right? We'll get through this, right? This too shall pass. But yes, there's going to be pain because we've been living in an imaginary economy for several years. Those are my thoughts. Please Google the Buffett indicator. Great investor in his 90s. Now is the time to research his work. Right? Google the Buffett indicator. Google the Shiller index. You'll realize that our stock market is 1.9 times where it should be. Some air is going to be let out of that balloon. Understand too, all of these leveraged industries, right? A home where most people use a mortgage to buy a house, right? Even the people who don't use a mortgage might want to leave their home if there are a bunch of for sale signs on the block. And they sense that the housing market's going to be flat, which it has been at times in the past for several years, right? Everything that's leveraged, everything where you have to go to a bank and say, hey, can you hook a brother up with a loan so I can go buy this car, so I can go buy this house? Understand, you're going to have volatility in those markets. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Again, if you're interested in peak oil, please Google Chris Martenson, peak prosperity, peak oil, right? If you want to hear from a great investor, one of history's best investors, on how what's coming is going to be the worst market downturn of his life, right? And I'm guessing he's in his 70s. Please Google Jim Rogers' view of the economy, right? And if you want to figure out exactly who is Donald Trump, someone who knows him well, who has been extremely influential, quite frankly, in the approach to markets of Ronald Reagan. And understand, what you have right now is a controlled demolition of the market, right? Akin to what happened in the early 80s when Reagan first took office and Paul Volcker had interest rates up around 15%, right? Just Google Art Laffer, Ronald Reagan, the word tariffs, and see what pulls up. In fact, let's get even more advanced than that. Why Google it? When you have Claude, when you have OpenAI, when you have Grok, when you have Microsoft Copilot, punch in what I've just been talking about in your AI search machine. Right, folks? It's 2025. Let's actually live in 2025 and see what it spits out. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video, which I'll post on always 1776.com. Another way to get to that site is keepingitfree.blogspot.com. And I'll also post it too, of course, on my flagship sports site, gamblersadvisory.com. Thanks for stopping by.